I'm Jane Corliss, and for some of you who may know her, I'm Catherine Allen's mom. And you know, she pressed me into service today, so I'm here. But we're here because of Eric, and he's a 7th generation resident of Live Oak, and there probably aren't a lot of people around who can make that claim. He grew up on his family's country homestead, and he developed a love for history, and it's still in there. You know how it is. And he went to Live Oak High School, Suwannee High School, excuse me, and also attended Montgomery, Alabama's Faulkner University, and he has a Bachelor of Science in History, and he got that at the age of 19 with a perfect 4-point grade point average. So how about that one? He returned home to Suwannee in 1998, and he started working for the Suwannee County Clerk of Courts, and he's still there today as county historian, records manager, and clerk to the board, among other things, you know, as needed, yes. Always on the bottom. Long list of things. Yes. He has been the youngest member of the Suwannee County Historical Commission, and he was appointed to that in 2003. He's a frequent presenter of local history and has been mentioned in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune. Now, I don't know many people who aren't politicians, for example, who have been mentioned in all of those publications. And that's as well as hundreds of other prominent national and international newspapers. He was awarded the Trailblazer Award by Suwannee County Chamber of Commerce for his work in preserving and presenting local history. He also published a weekly historical column for the local newspaper, the Suwannee Democrat, when it was still in existence. And he married his college sweetheart, which is sweet. Her name's Sarah. Aww. And they live in Live Oak along with their 2 children, Alex and Abby. He's also the author of 5 published books about Suwannee County: Reflections of Suwannee County, Suwannee Memories, There Let Me Live and Die. Does that go together?
There Let Me Live and Die.
Okay, that's one. Okay. Images of America, Suwannee County, and Lost Suwannee County. So he knows more about this area than probably most other people.
Maybe.
A lot of other people. So that's the end of mine, but it's time for his.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. You can throw money at me, I'm okay with that. All right. For the next less than an hour, I'm going to talk to you about railroads. Now, some of you have obviously already heard the longer version of this, but not everybody has, and it's being videoed, it's awesome. Thank you for that. But railroads in Suwannee County, and as I was telling folks that were on the tour at the museum a few minutes ago, railroads have been very influential in Suwannee County's history, and pretty much every existing community owes either their establishment or their continuation because of the railroads. If you look at the old railroad lines, you will see that pretty much every community we've got was on a railroad. and that's why they were established. So they have been very important. Now, I don't have time to talk about every single logging railroad and those kinds of things in Suwannee County. It's just, there's not enough time. Even with the hour-and-a-half long presentation, there's not enough time. And this one's the 45-minute presentation. So you will be getting a briefer overview of railroads. So, any questions before I begin? All right. The first railroad that came through Suwannee County was the Pensacola and Georgia Railroad, the P&G Railroad. It was chartered in January of 1853, and it was completed in 1861, basically the month before the Civil War started out. And you can see it circled there in the picture, but it went from Tallahassee, originally from Tallahassee to Lake City, and then the Florida Central, another one, the Atlantic and Gulf originally, picked up from Lake City to Jacksonville. And they met again in Lake City. Over the years, they were bought and sold and whatnot. But the president of the Pensacola and Georgia Railroad was a guy by the name of Edward Houston, which I'm going to assume is where Houston, our first real county seat in Suwannee County, where that name came from. There's also Houston Street over on the west side of town, which was the original downtown of Live Oak. And I'm assuming it was named after him also. And that's kind of one of my tests for folks when they come into Suwannee County and when they're asking questions to see if they're from here or not. I will show them a picture with that name on there and ask how they pronounce it. If they pronounce it Houston, I will know they are not from here. But Houston, Edward Houston. So that railroad, P&G, Pensacola and Georgia, had to cross the Suwannee River. And so the original railroad crossing was a wooden covered railroad bridge there at what's now Suwannee River State Park. At the time, it was the community of Columbus, one of our early founded communities that actually had a government anyway from the 1840s on. But that was a wooden covered railroad bridge, and of course, railroads at that time, their engines used what? Wood, coal, wood, but usually wood at this point, wood burning in a lot of cases. And either way, regardless, it would be throwing up embers that could burn down wood. So what they did at this bridge particularly was they stationed usually kids that would get paid a little bit to be on either end of the railroad crossing. And once the engine went through, they would run in with buckets of water and put out the little embers that were now burning inside the railroad bridge. So that was there. And when the Civil War began in 1861, this was a focus of Northern forces once they landed in Florida for about the third or fourth time in Jacksonville. And in 1864, the Battle of Lusty. This was the major objective. There were several other secondary objectives, but this was the major objective for Union forces. They wanted to burn it down because this railroad, P&G and all the ones that were associated with it, were providing a lot of material, food, timber, all those kinds of things for the Confederacy. So they wanted to destroy it. And so the Battle of Lusty was fought to stop the Union forces from getting to this bridge, this location. One of the things, because Confederate forces knew they were coming to that bridge, they had stationed as a last-ditch effort about 15 men on either side to say, if worse comes to worse, burn that bridge down. We don't want the Union forces getting to Tallahassee. And because of the Battle of Lusty and then later on the Battle of Natural Bridge the next year, south of Tallahassee, Tallahassee was basically the only state capital in the Confederacy east of the Mississippi that was not captured by Union forces. So the P&G continued to operate. One of the things that happened was in 1861, this is a transcript of a document done in early 1861, May 1st to be exact, and it's the first time Live Oak is mentioned that I've found anyway in any records. So Live Oak was established as a train station on the Pensacola and Georgia, and they decided to make a connector because at the time the P&G was only in the Atlantic and Gulf beside it, pretty much didn't run into anything else. They wanted to run up through the rest of the Confederacy because the war had just started. They wanted to get men and materials north into places like Virginia that were seeing more action. And so they decided to build a connector line between Live Oak and a place in Georgia called Lawton, which is now DuPont. And so they started building that in 1861. And it was completed basically the month before the Civil War ended, so it didn't really help much. But it was built, but the good thing is, after the war, it brought a lot of folks into Suwannee County, particularly, because it was pretty much the first stop once you came into Florida, and then you could go either east and west, or go back up north. There was no south-going railroad at that point. So a lot of people stopped in Live Oak, and they never left. That is a picture of that connector line after the Civil War, and you can see how it connects with some of the other railroads going further up into the United States, or what will become, be back to being the United States by this point. So, in 1866, the Pensacola in Georgia was running out of money. They were having some financial difficulties, like a lot of other places, and so the P&G sold its connector line to the Atlantic and Gulf, which was the one that went from Lake City over to Jacksonville. So the Atlantic and Gulf got control of that connector. Well, 1868, there was financial panic, and P&G had to sell off its assets, and they sold to a guy named George Sampson. He was a scalawag. Basically, he was somebody from the South who kind of supported the Union during the war, and he kind of took advantage of a lot of folks. And so he bought it out, and then in 1869, he merged it to become the Jacksonville, Pensacola, and Mobile Railroad. He merged it with the Florida Atlantic and Gulf Railroad, which was the current name for the other one that went from Lake City to Jacksonville. So all these, as we go through this, you will see the same railroad line being named a half a dozen times or more. It gets very confusing sometimes, even for me. So anyway, George Sampson, and then Milton Littlefield, who was called the Prince of Carpetbaggers. He was a Union general. He came down and they helped buy up this stuff. They were later charged with things like fraud, embezzlement, lying, cheating, all that good stuff. So this is the J.P.M. Depot in Tallahassee, which was built for Pensacola in Georgia in 1858. It still exists as far as I know. So that's probably one of the oldest buildings associated with what used to be called Pensacola and Georgia. There we go. See, John knows all about that.
Johnson was sitting right down that track. They did it.
That's cool. So a lot of history just through that one building there in Tallahassee. Well, the J.P.M. continued for a few years, and then in 1882, Sir Edward Reed purchased it along with some others, and he renamed it the Florida Central and Western Railroad. And he merged it and consolidated it with several other railroads. Come on in. And the Florida Railway and Navigation Company, and then it was renamed the Florida Central and Peninsula Railroad. So they kept buying and selling. It just was crazy. Well, eventually, the Seaboard Airline Railway purchased a majority of that stake, and it leased it, and then it bought it. And so by 1903, the Seaboard Airline purchased it outright, and it became part of their system. And that lasted until 1967, when it merged with the Atlantic Coastline to form the Seaboard Coastline, excuse me. And then in 1982, it became part of the Seaboard system, then CSX, and then it became Florida Gulf and Atlantic, which is a very similar name to what part of the original was. So at the end of this presentation, I've got a list showing all these different names because they do run together. They run together. Now, Henry Plant, you can't talk about railroads in Florida without the two Henrys. Henry Flagler, who didn't come through here really, and Henry Plant. Henry Plant was born up in a place called Branford, Connecticut, and that's why we have a Branford, Florida in Suwannee County, because it was named after his hometown. Well, he moved down to the south. By the 1850s, he was running basically one of the express companies. When the war began, he pretty much bought up the southern portion of it because the company that was stationed up in the north realized we're going to lose all of our assets, so let's just sell them while we can. So he kind of made a good deal, and he continued to run them. And by the end of the war, he was a pretty wealthy man, and so he started buying up railroads. He knew that the South would recover, and he knew that railroads were that primary focus for recovery. And so he bought up several of them. One of them became the Savannah, Florida and Western, and that was basically from a couple of railroads he bought up from bankrupt companies like the Charleston and Savannah Railroad, and it expanded all over the place. We're talking about that more in just a minute because he expanded into lots of stuff beyond railroads. But in the meantime, here in Suwannee County, we have the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff Railroad. that was established, or chartered anyway, in 1881. And that was kind of to continue that Live Oak to Lawton connector. They wanted to start going south. And so they went from Live Oak, hopefully to Rollins Bluff. Rollins Bluff was what Branford was called at the time. And so they chartered it, started working on it, and they built a lot of it with slave labor, or with convict labor, which were basically slaves in the 1870s. And there's a book called American Siberia. I don't have time to read out of it, but there's a book called American Siberia. And a part of that book, most of the book happens in Suwannee County, but there's a part of the book that talks about them building this railroad line. And it's kind of interesting, some of the stories, because some folks, especially in the south part of the county, had never heard of a train, had never seen one. And so the first time they see this steel beast coming with smoke puffing out and making noises, one of the families, frontier families, was they were scared. They just kind of ran back to the woods and never came back out. Another gentleman who had lived here for a long time, been scared to nothing, killed bears, more bears than he could count. When he was told to go to Jacksonville for a jury case, he was told he had to go on by railroad, and he freaked out. But eventually he was coerced into getting on board, and afterwards it's like, that's no big deal, I like it. So he would use it a lot after that. So that book has lots of interesting stories like that about the railroads. So another one that was going on was the Suwannee River Railway. That was established by Lewis Bucky, who was a partner of George Drew. Their business was established in the community called Ellaville, which was just across the river from what is now the Suwannee River State Park, but used to be Columbus. And they established sawmills and expanded beyond that. Originally, it was more like a flowing timber to those big sawmills there in Ellaville. But he established that, and gradually it made its way all the way down to Lurville. Now, they had big plans, as you can see in this picture, all the way down to Cedar Key, but it did not quite go that far. By 1895, it was purchased by a guy named Edward J. Carter of New York City, and it was incorporated, and he wanted to, again, continue to extend it, but it just didn't do well. That was the plans. This picture, you can kind of see it in black, is how far it got, basically down to the Suwannee River, downriver from Lauraville, or Lauraville as it says there. That's kind of about as far as they got before they ran out of money. This is another map that shows that Fredericksburg was the community that it stopped at, the endpoint, and that was close to what's now McAlpin. And it was abandoned shortly after this picture from the 1890s, but it shows up on maps of Suwannee County for another 10 or so years, but it had been abandoned by this point. Other railroads coming in, lots of railroads coming in the post-Civil War. Live Oak, Tampa, and Charlotte Harbor Railroad was incorporated in 1881, and that was incorporated by Henry Plant and some other folks, and they wanted to go down through Branford and all the way down to Tampa. And so he started working on this railroad, but as he's working southward, he finds out there's a railroad working northward. And so they basically negotiate a deal to complete it to each other and go from that, but then he bought out the other company anyway, so either way he got what he wanted, which was going all the way down to the Tampa area. But then this one, such as it was built, was then absorbed into part of his larger group, into that part of that Savannah, Florida and Western Railway. Well, after a few years, Henry Plant had so many different things, whether it was railroads, steamboats, hotels, that it just came to be called the Plant System. It was his system. So he died in 1899 at the age of 80. He was buried up in Branford, Connecticut. But his empire, his railroad empire specifically, was sold to the Atlantic Coast Line for $46.5 million, which is about $2 billion today. So it was sold. It had 2,200 miles of railroad track. And so it was the largest railroad system in operation in the 19th century. So lots of railroads, lots of hotels and stuff. These red in the here, I don't know if you can see it, but all that red stuff is part of the Plant system. And he actually had steamboats that would sail to places like Cuba, Havana and such, and go over to New Orleans. So he had a lot of stuff. That picture, let's see if I got a picture, I know, circa 1900. Pretty much, as it's still called the plant system, so it's before the Atlantic Coastline bought it out. So there might be a year on there, I can't see it. But yeah, basically 1900, that's what it looked like as he died. Lots of railroads, 2,200 miles just the railroads. Continuing on with the Atlantic Coastline, which was the old plant system, the railroad part of it. In 1918, we've got World War I going on around the world. The United States entered the war in 1917. Well, the Suwannee Democrat mentions that the ACL Bridge going north into Hamilton County burns down. It's close to basically part of where the Spirit of the Suwannee is today. That's where it crossed the river. People are paranoid. If you read part of this article, you will read that some folks thought it might have been sabotaged by Germans or somebody that were friendly with the Germans because this railroad was being used to transport troops and goods. So I'm thinking it was probably just either an accidental burning or maybe arson, regular arson, which is still bad. But nothing I have found in our existing records indicate that it was a sabotage operation. So just paranoia of war. All right, the Dowling family. Thomas Dowling was born in Hamilton County, 1851. He moved to Suwannee County very shortly thereafter and established sawmills starting in Live Oak, just basically a block to the east of here was a large sawmill that he had. But he also had to extend it because as they cut the timber out around Live Oak, they kept going westward. So he and his nephew, Robert L. Dowling, were very influential in building up a number of industries and railroads in this area. So as he is expanding his businesses, Thomas Dowling and others established what's called the Live Oak, Louisville, and Dead Man's Bay Railroad. This was in 1893. Thomas McIntosh of Louisville was the vice president. A guy by the name of Frank White was the secretary, and then Lewis or R.L. Dowling was the treasurer. So it's still kind of a family operation halfway. And so they established this, and their purpose is to go from Live Oak through Louisville all the way over to Lafayette and Taylor counties and into Dead Man's Bay. Well, it's about 60 miles. Now, one of the reasons this one was formed specifically was in the 1890s, phosphate had been discovered down in the Louisville area. And so everybody was buying up property, everybody was trying to access that phosphate. And so some of these railroads, even one or two I've talked about previously, were wanting to get down there. So the Live Oak, Louisville, and Dead Man's Bay Railroad was established mainly to get to that phosphate and then be able to ship it overseas. Well, they couldn't afford the entire thing, and so they started building it, but they never were able to finish it. And so that kind of hampered production of phosphate. The Live Oak and Gulf Railway Company purchased it in 1895, but not the charter. So that brings us up to Live Oak and Gulf Railway. And as we go through this, you will see there are several very similarly named railroads. You've got the Live Oak and Gulf. You've got the Live Oak and Perry. You've got the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf. Lots of similar names. Some related to each other, some not. But the Live Oak and Gulf Railway was chartered in 1895. The folks running it were either from New York, mainly, or from Ocala, which Ocala had a big bit of phosphate down there at the time in the 1890s. And so they bought it up, and they started making money off that phosphate mine in Louisville. But by 1897, they figured out that phosphate just was not good for the purposes they wanted, fertilizer and weapons, because it had too much iron in it. So it was basically worthless. And so this railroad, among several others that were building, just kind of languished for many years. It was eventually purchased by a Southern Investment Company and merged to become the Suwannee and San Pedro in 1905, and merged with them. So that's a photograph from 1896 in Louisville. Which brings us up to the Drew family. George Drew, governor of Florida, former governor of Florida by this point, and his two sons, George and Frank Drew, were very instrumental in setting up not just sawmills, but also railroads in and around Suwannee County. George Drew was born in a place called Alton, New Hampshire. He moved to the South during the Civil War. He was in Columbus, Georgia. When the war ended, he wanted to go overseas, but instead he stopped in Madison County, technically, and built a house there and decided to live there and that's where he lived for most of the rest of his life until he moved over to Jacksonville. But they established several railroads, he and his family. Basically, Frank, the one on the right, was big into railroads. His brother, George L., was bigger into the sawmill. So you have these brothers working in conjunction with their dad for sawmills and railroads associated with them, but not just logging railroads. They wanted to go into the transportation business. And so in 1899, they incorporated the Suwannee and San Pedro Railroad. And also some men from Baltimore and Jacksonville helped with that. It was a big deal, lots of money. And so this was kind of built to access a lot of sawmills throughout Suwannee County, Lafayette, Taylor County, that the Drew family had either bought up or they were chartering. And so they were able to buy up this charter and establish a bridge connection or a railroad connection by barge, and were able to eventually build lots to it. Let's see, going through my notes here. Governor Drew died in 1900, but the sons continued on it. It was built on the 3-foot narrow gauge instead of the normal 5-foot, which kind of hampered some operations. And it only got to Alton, Florida, which was in Lafayette County, a logging area named after Drew's birthplace. So lots of these railroads, lots of grandiose schemes and ideas for them, but they really don't get that far in most cases. St. Mary's, Suwannee, and Gulf Railway, chartered in 1903 by George and Frank Drew, along with some other folks. And so they charter this railroad, and they want to go through Nassau County, through Georgia, through North Florida, and all the way over to Wakulla counties. And so that is one of the many railroads that is started, anyway, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This kind of comes about because the Drew family is having a turf war, if you will, with the Seaboard Airline, the SAL. And so he doesn't want to use, the family doesn't want to use the SAL property, so they're going to build their own railroad, which they think is cheaper for some reason. But they didn't have enough money. They couldn't really put it in. So then it dies a quick death. Doesn't get anywhere. Come on in. Glad that y'all are here. Well, the Florida Railway is yet another Drew associated railroad in Suwannee County. And that one is a merger between the Suwannee and San Pedro, and then the Live Oak and Gulf, the one we just talked about a few minutes ago, and some other railroads also. So they merged to become the Florida Railway. They started in Live Oak. You can kind of see it in kind of purplish, reddish. And they are trying to get across, again, to skirt around the ACL and the SAL at this point, which the ACL is basically going east and west, and SAL is going north and south. So the Drew family does not want to use either one of those if they can avoid it. So they just, again, try to build their own railroad. It competes for a few years, and it's a big competitor to the Live Oak, Peekin Gulf, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But Thomas Dowling, who's a big part of the Live Oak, Peekin Gulf, buys up a lot of the sawmills that the Drew family was using along this Florida Railway. So it's got its own issues. They're not as profitable as they hoped they would be. But one of the things that still exists is the Florida Railway Bridge, or the Drew Bridge, as a lot of people call it. Is there a way to go back? Anyway, where it crosses the Suwannee River at a place called Wilmarth, which was downriver from Louisville. They had this bridge installed, and this was the time we still had steamboats. Steamboats I'll talk about in a couple hours in another presentation. But we still had steamboats along the Suwannee River. And so this bridge had to be able to turn to allow steamboats to go up and down river. And so they put it in, and it looks like this is a very, very old bridge. Now, they used to think that it was installed and built by the Drew family in the early 1900s, but it looks like from the information that still exists, it was probably built around the 1860s, maybe 1870s, somewhere else, and then moved here to Suwannee County, because a lot of the information on it, like the millings and stuff, are from a company that was out of existence by about 1872. Plus, it was kind of like an experimental bridge. They had not standardized in the 1870s what the best kind of railroad bridge was, and so everybody was trying out all kinds of different experimental ones. And so this is one of those experiments, but it still exists today. That picture at the bottom is One took about probably 10 years ago, and you can still see it. And that's the Florida Railway. That's crossing it right there on the top part. That picture is from 1909, I believe.
Do you know how they turn that bridge?
I've heard different stories. Somebody inside of it. I've heard horses. There's basically gears and stuff inside, so it sounds like folks did it on the inside. So it's a good fishing place from what I've been told. So if you like to fish, go down there by the Drew Bridge. There's if you go to Lafayette County, there's actually a boat ramp right there just downriver of it. So you get to the ramp, and there's the bridge right there. The Florida Railway only lasted for about 10 years. By 1916, it had pretty much ceased its operations. It was behind on its payments. It got so bad that its workers were even sabotaging the railroad. The owner, George L. Drew, he and his wife could not travel by day because it was dangerous for them. People were out for their heads. The funny thing is, the SAL, who the Drews did not like, the Seaboard Airline had offered to buy it up. And the Drews hated them. They could have. Offered. Let me rephrase that. They could have offered to buy it up, but they hated the Drews so much that's like, let them burn. So, I mean, it would have been helpful for the SAL. They could have had another access into other areas that they didn't, but they hated the Drew family. So they just sat back and watched the Drew family fortune crumble. So this is a picture in Live Oak, and you've got the smaller one, which is the Florida Railway, passing the Seaboard Airline on the other side. And again, these railroads were several railroads that used this very building when it was on the other side of the museum. This was the Union Passenger Depot. And so you had several of these, the Atlantic Coastline, the Seaboard Airline, the Florida Railway, and the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf we're going to talk about in a few minutes. They all used this one building, which is why it's called the Union Passenger Depot. They were able to get together enough to do that. So while the Florida Railway is crashing and burning, you've got R.L. Dowling and Sons Lumber Company, and this company began in the 1890s, and I've already kind of alluded to it. It was a way to bring timber to the sawmills that the Dowling family owned. Well, they gradually expanded westward until they got over to a place called Hudson upon the Suwannee, and they established a big sawmill there. And by the early 1900s, they had renamed that village Dowling Park in honor of that family. And so they built that, and they had ideas of expanding over into Lafayette County also. So in 1903, that short line, that logging railroad more or less, was approached by a guy named Skelton Williams. He was president of the Seaboard Airline, and he wanted to use the Dowling family in his turf wars with the Drew family. So all these fights between all these different railroads just in Suwannee County. Very interesting. And so the Dowlings incorporated as the Live Oak and Perry. So we've seen the Live Oak and Gulf. We see the Live Oak and Perry, and then just in a few years, you're going to see another similar name railroad coming up. So in 1903, it was incorporated as Live Oak and Perry. They could not get all the way to Perry, though, because they ran out of money. Mr. Williams was kicked out as president, and the Dowlings didn't have enough money to do it themselves. So yet again, this is another railroad where you look at the names of it, and they usually didn't go to either one of those towns. Now, it did go to Live Oak, but it didn't go to Perry. This is an article from the 1904 Suwannee Democrat. So you can see the timetable over there going to basically Dowling Park in that region. Most of those communities on there no longer exist. Places like Star and Lancaster and such, they don't exist anymore. So, Atlantic Coastline wants to get into this area. They've already got this railroad that we have just out here beside us. They're already there, but they want to get further into the interior of Suwannee, Taylor, Lafayette, all those counties. And so they approach the Dowling family, and they decide, hey, let's help you out. And so they help finance what comes to be called the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf Railroad, which is incorporated in 1906. So you've had the Live Oak and Perry, you've had the Live Oak and Gulf, now you got the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf Railroad. The nickname is Loc and Gopher because it was originally a logging railroad, and logging railroads were not built to the same standards as a passenger railroad. You just threw down some rails to get to the next spot where the trees were. And so when they used this original logging railroad to incorporate as this passenger and logging railroad and cargo railroad, it was pretty bumpy. A bumpy ride, so it was called the Locum Gopher. They joked about the gopher holes, made it bumpy. One of the other names for it was the living on peas and grits. So they did what they could do. So this railroad was very profitable for this area for several decades. The Atlantic coastline used it for a lot of shipping, and it worked its way towards Perry and even beyond that, a couple miles past that. Well, in 1918, it was sold to the Atlantic coastline. In 1928, it was sold to the Brooks Scanlon Corporation, which was basically a large sawmill operation over in Taylor County. And so they bought it out, and it was still being used, being called the Live Oak Pier and Gulf. It was still being used here in Suwannee County, and it was a big shipper of watermelon, of corn, cotton, tobacco from Suwannee County. And so some of you who may have lived here many, many years ago might remember those times when it was that season, and they would come here and buy the trainload, watermelons and tobacco and stuff. Well, this railroad gets purchased out by a couple more places. The Southern Railway Company in 1954, then Georgia Southern in Florida in 1971. And most of it has been abandoned, especially in Suwannee County, but there's still little bits and pieces of it left under a variety of other names. But this is kind of, you can see where it was as of 1955, as it was part of a larger railroad. So it went all the way past Perry. This was from Russell Tedder, I believe I got this photograph from, and he worked for the railroad for many, many years. Wrote a lot of history about it. You've got other railroads going on, ones like the Suwannee River and White Springs Railway. It was chartered in 1909. That's the one with your, that's the one. And yeah, see, a lot of family members still of some of the folks here. Chartered by W.L. Tedder. He was president. C.H. Tedder was honored. Also Barkus, W.W. Pennington, C.D. Blackwell, and H.H. Brown. There you go. There's your Mr. Brown. And it was chartered to carry folks from Live Oak to White Springs. So it was a short line railroad, just to go about 16 miles. Not exactly sure if it ever was completed. There was a 1910 report showed it only had 4.5 miles of tracks. So out of the 16 miles, it was only just a little over a quarter of the way there. And it lasted about 3 years, and then it stopped showing up on railroad reports after 1912. So this is a 1910 map showing the rail line from Live Oak going over to your top right towards White Springs. That was the plan anyway. And they might have graded the road, but they never apparently finished it. One of the many railroads that died a premature death. Now then, I said I wasn't going to talk much about logging railroads. Obviously, I have a little bit. But I want to talk about this specific railroad, logging railroad, Bosch and Hagan. Basically, they owned a lot of sawmills in southern Suwannee County and also in Lafayette County. Well, they didn't have a railroad bridge down there. So what they would do is they would barge over old steam engines that had been retired by the passenger services. They would buy them up at a cheap price and then use them to carry the logs from out in the forest back to the sawmills. And so one of them was being transported between Suwannee County and Lafayette County, I get it right in a minute, Lafayette County, down around Lureville when it fell in the river. And this was probably the early 1900s, first decade probably. Well, it was an old engine. Again, it had been already retired by the other services. And so instead of raising it up, they figured it was worth nothing and left it in the river. And there it stayed until 1979, when a man by the name of James Lancaster, who had grown up around Lureville and as a boy remembered seeing part of it when the river was low, he had enough money to raise it and put it in front of a store in Lureville. And there it sat for a few years. And then there was lots of financial stuff. And eventually it was transported over to Tallahassee, to the Department of Agriculture building over in Tallahassee. And there it sits today. Now, the interesting thing about it is this engine could very well be the oldest existing engine in the United States. It sounds like it was probably built, based upon the configuration, built probably in the 1850s, is what they're thinking, between 1850 and 1855. So it's an old engine. And because it was worth nothing to them in the early 1900s, they left it. But you can go see it today. Was it the Doyle Connor Agriculture Building over in Tallahassee? It's there. It's now covered. It's got a covered depot-looking place. Lots of history there. I was there for the dedication of that building, and lots of good pictures and stuff. So that's interesting. Now then, as railroads go, I've already said that several communities were established because of the railroad. One of them, again, being Live Oak. That was here by 1861. The original downtown Live Oak was over on Houston Street, where Houston crosses the railroad tracks, close to First Baptist Church. That was the original downtown Live Oak. This depot from the 1870s, 1877 specifically, was over there somewhere in that location apparently, at one point. But by the post-Civil War era, we've got the Parshleys coming in, and they moved Live Oak to here, the downtown Live Oak, to where it is today, where we have it today. So you would see a depot like this over at the original part of Live Oak, and then this one here specifically was other side of this freight depot by the 1870s. Not near as good as what we had. This photograph was taken from the water tower over here, Dowling's Water Tower, between 1897 and 1903. And I know that because the museum was built in 1904, and it would be on the right-hand side, and it's not there. So this shows the old Atlantic coastline and the old passenger depot buildings that used to be there. You can see several railroad tracks going through here and several roads. This was downtown Live Oak by this point. But this, it's hard to see. And this here is Ohio Avenue. These buildings, most of these buildings still exist. And the museum, the building beside us, is here today. So that gives you an idea of where those were. So this is the Atlantic Coastline Freight Depot, built in 1903, I believe, and it served for about 60 years as a railroad, as the freight depot portion before it was abandoned, and then it was renovated in the 1990s, became the Suwannee County Historical Museum. So if you haven't been over there, please go. So that was it in the 1920s. That's a picture of it in the 1960s while it was still in use. And then that is a much more recent picture of it. This is a picture taken about 1913, looking in this direction towards the Dowling Water Tower in the back. As you can see, this is the freight depot, the museum over here on the left. And this building we're in right now, this building is on the other side of the tracks. Over here on the railroad tracks that still exist today, here's Connor Street here, which you can see. So this building was cut in half and moved, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. But they needed a better railroad, a passenger depot, than what was here to begin with, was basically just a platform. So if it was raining, you were going to get wet. So they wanted some kind of enclosed building. So they built it in 1909 eventually. And it served for about 60 years while we have passenger service here in Live Oak. That is a drawing downtown, which shows the ACL Freight Depot, which is now the museum, and then it shows the old passenger depot. Yeah, in the early 1900s, before they built this building. So another photograph taken from Ohio Avenue, looking east, showing the freight depot and the passenger depots. That's where this building was originally located. Well, eventually, the successor railroads that owned this building decided they wanted to use the space for something different, wanted to tear down the building, but they wanted to offer it to the community first. And so a group of folks got together, called themselves Pride in Action, and bought up the building and paid to have it moved to this location today. So they were able to do that. And then it sat for 30 years while people tried to get grant funding for it. Eventually, the county was able to get it, And they renovated first the roof and then the interior section. And if you got time, some other time I can show you pictures of the courthouse and probably over here in the museum of what this building looked like. And this was an open area, no floor. Lots of issues. Seaboard Airline, one of those other big railroads, had their own depot in downtown Live Oak. It was across the street eventually, close to where Armando's or whatever the Mexican place is across the street is, what it's called, Fuego Azteca, I believe. Anyway, it was just south of that and to the west in the Y, what used to be called the Y, where the railroads split out, depending on which direction you were going. It was there by 1903, so it was an old building, and it lasted for many years. That's a picture of it in the 1960s. And the old H&F, Huffman and Gilmore, not H&F, Huffman and Gilmore there to the left. So an old building, smaller building,
Yes, I can remember when that top was blown off of it.
1972. So we had a storm come through and ripped off the roof. It was an old building. I don't know exactly how old it is. It was there by the first drawings I've got, first maps from 1903, so it was at least that old. But they decided it wasn't worth saving or rebuilding, and so they sold it to a gentleman who then tore it down and used it to build a couple houses, because it still had some good beams. So you can see where it was. There's the museum. What's down the museum there on the right-hand side. Other communities in Suwannee County also had their own depots. This is the Welborn one, circa 1960, no longer there. Branford had a depot for many years. It's been renovated, and it is being used by one of the civic groups down there, the Branford Shrine Club, as of 1982, when it got moved to where it is today. You've also got, this is probably the one in Dowling Park, circa early 1900s. If you look closely, you can see where there's like a colored entrance, colored restroom, and a white. That was the time of segregation. So one will say colored, one will say white, if you look on the doors really carefully. Let's see. As the automobile was introduced, as better roads were built, as other forms of transportation came online, like aircraft, it became harder and harder for all these smaller railroads to stay in business. And so gradually, those that had survived the initial creation of themselves, that were able to build and continue to operate, they had to start shutting down because they just could not afford to compete with automobiles, especially semis, things like that. So they were abandoned. They were merged with other bigger railroads or just sold to other entities. So today we've only got one railroad coming through Suwannee County. Ironically, it's the same line, basically, under a variety of names, but the same line. That was our first railroad built, the old Pensacola, Georgia. It's the same line, basically, same route that is still used today. So, I told you I had a little drawing of different railroads. So this is the major east-west running railroad. This is the name, and actually I don't even think I've got, well, yeah, it's Florida Gulf and Atlantic, also known as Rail USA. So this was that name in all these various years for this one railroad going east to west here. So the Pensacola, Georgia, going down through the Seaboard Airline, which it was for many years. So lots of names. Same railroad. That's just that one. Then we have the north-south running one. And that was several different ones at the top. The Live Oak and Lawton Connector. And then separately started with the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff. And then separately from that was the Live Oak, Tampa, and Charlotte. But they eventually got bought out and merged as part of the Savannah, Florida and Western, aka the plant system from Henry Plant. And they were Atlantic Coastline for many years until they merged with the east-west running, with the Seaboard Airline I talked about, and became the Seaboard System, CSX. And then in the 1980s, they abandoned the north-south running portion. Now, part of that, if you go down to the south part of the county, is part of what's called the Greenway Trail. So you can walk on it, hike on it, bike on it. That's part of the old railroad line. I don't know how far it's going to get up through Live Oak, but that is what that one was. So, That is the abbreviated version of railroads in Suwannee County. Do I have any questions? Thank you. Thank y'all for coming. Thank you.